Merci beaucoup, Madame la Sénatrice, Madame la...
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, honorable senators. It's my pleasure to be here this morning to address an issue that is very important to the people of Alberta, accompanied by my minister.
You are discussing in Bill C-69, and I look forward to her participation in this testimony. Madam Chairman, this bill, if passed in anything like its current form, will, in the submission of the Alberta government, be a disaster for the Canadian economy and will seriously rupture national unity. If it passes in anything like its current form, the government of Alberta will launch an immediate constitutional challenge of Bill C-69 as an obvious and flagrant violation of our exclusive constitutional jurisdiction to regulate the production of our natural resources, a power that was won by Premier Peter Lougheed in 1981 in the Constitutional Convention held in this building, without which Alberta never would have signed its consent to the patriation of the Constitution in 1982. Alberta's consent in the Constitution Act was predicated on it obtaining exclusive constitutional jurisdiction in Section 92A for the regulation of the production of natural resources, specifically of oil and gas. And the bill before you proposes in a flagrant way to violate that exclusive power, which was a condition precedent of Alberta's consent to the Constitution Act. Madam President, recent polling indicates that as many as 50% of Albertans indicate that they support the concept of secession from the Canadian Federation. I and our government are dedicated to national unity. I'm here to convey to you and your fellow senators that there is a growing crisis of national unity in Alberta, which would be exacerbated by the adoption of this bill and other policies like the proposed tanker ban in Bill C-48. In Alberta, this is known as the No More Pipelines Act, precisely at a moment that we are living through a period of prolonged economic decline and stagnation in Alberta, in large measure because of our inability to get Alberta's and Canada's natural resources to global markets. This has caused enormous economic suffering in Alberta. Nearly 200,000 unemployed people, tens of thousands who have left the labor market and given up looking for work, tens of thousands who have left our province, many of whom moved to Alberta from provinces in eastern and central Canada to participate in our resource industry, but no longer have employment. Incomes are down in Alberta by over 6% in the past 4 years. So many families are struggling to get by. And all of this, in part, because we have apparently, many Canadian leaders have decided to surrender growing global energy markets to some of the world's worst regimes, the OPEC dictatorships, Russia, and the United States, which has doubled its energy production in the past decade, while U.S. foundations have funded a campaign to landlock Canadian energy, a campaign that funded organizations that have called for and support this bill precisely because they see it as another tool in landlocking Canadian energy. I note, Madam President, that the very same organizations who endorsed this bill, who opposed Northern Gateway Pipeline, who opposed the Energy East Pipeline, who opposed Keystone XL Pipeline, who oppose the Trans Mountain Pipeline, who want to make it sure that this bill prevents any other major pipeline project from being proposed, those very same groups have done nothing to stop the doubling of U.S. oil production, the massive expansion of the oil pipeline system in the United States, or a 10% increase in the production of oil across the world in the past decade alone. They have focused in this bill, in C-48, in their campaign of obstruction, they have focused exclusively on bottlenecking Canadian energy. I think it's incumbent upon you as members of Canada's upper chamber to ask, why are these organizations so committed to undermining the vital economic interests of this country while doing nothing to reduce or diminish growing global demand and production for oil? And I think the answer is simple. It is because we as Canadians and our political leadership have invited this campaign of obstruction and aggression through weakness, because we have political leadership willing to introduce legislation such as this. And that is why our government, which was sworn in 2 days ago, is launching a strategy to stand up for Alberta. No longer will the people of Alberta quietly accept policies such as this, which constitute a direct attack on our vital economic interests. We Albertans are proud of what we do. We are proud to have been to have the third largest reserves of recoverable oil in the world, the fourth largest reserves of natural gas. We are proud to produce those resources at the world's highest environmental, human rights, and labor standards. We are proud of the remarkable innovation, the massive investments made by our energy companies in constantly shrinking the environmental footprint and the carbon intensity of Alberta energy. We are proud conservationists. Avec, comme la sénatrice a dit, la plus belle province.
As the senator said, God's country, and we're very proud of our natural environment, and we will protect it. No matter what political stripe, Albertans will protect the environment. This bill, as far as we're concerned, and from an energy point of view, it's not an issue of protecting the environment. It's a total lack of balance in the essential protection of the environment and economic growth.
Bill completely misses the balance that we all know we need between environmental protection and economic development. And that is why this bill is opposed across the political spectrum in Alberta, and I believe has growing opposition across Canada. You heard recently from my distinguished predecessor, Premier Notley, former Premier Notley, who spoke eloquently about Alberta's opposition to this bill. I endorse the words that she presented to this committee. However, I want to be very clear. We are not simply here to say that this bill needs amendment. In our view, if this bill continues in anything like its current form, it is unacceptable. The government of Alberta has submitted a series of amendments which our government endorses, amendments which are essential to the protection of provincial jurisdiction, in part the respect for Section 92A of the Constitution Act. And we also endorse the amendments brought forward by the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association and the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. In our view, these amendments must together form a package to do anything remotely like saving this bill so that it does not create an even deeper crisis in investor confidence. Madam President, one of the reasons for the prolonged economic adversity in my province is because of the flight of tens of billions of dollars of capital, primarily from our oil and gas sector. A capital that has fled and taken with it jobs and equipment from the Canadian oil and gas industry to primarily the American oil and gas industry. This money has not left the production of energy. It has simply left the employment of Canadians. Once again, highlighting the futile hypocrisy of those seeking to bottleneck Canadian energy. In my province, while we suffer from 7% unemployment, which I think masks the real numbers, in the energy-producing states south of the border, they benefit from 2 to 3% unemployment in Texas and in Oklahoma, Colorado, and North Dakota. While there's been a massive decline in oil and gas investment in Canada, there's been a massive concomitant increase of over 5% in the United States over the past 4 years. This is not about global prices. This is about policy, a policy environment which is further damaged by the uncertainty created by Bill C-69. So, Madam President, the C.D. Howe Institute in 2018 estimated that 36 projects worth $77 billion alone were cancelled in Canada. 2018 was the worst year for Canadian oil and gas financing in 2 decades. Over the past decade, the annual return on Canada's oil and gas equities have been a negative 0.5%, and they constituted the biggest share of the Toronto Stock Exchange, versus a positive 5.5% growth for oil and gas equities. So I ask anybody, Madam President, who thinks that there's some virtue in further strangling the industry that has been a key engine of Canadian prosperity, I ask them to account for the fact that all they've done is to ship capital, jobs, and energy production to another jurisdiction, a jurisdiction that does not have carbon taxes, that has lower environmental regulations, that has a much easier time of building pipelines, and a jurisdiction which has gone from a significant importer of Canadian energy to a net exporter of their own energy. In 1980, Premier Peter Lougheed described the National Energy Program as, quotes, the Ottawa government, without negotiation and without agreement, simply walking into our home and occupying the living room. That is exactly how I would describe Bill C-69. Dans sa forme actuelle, le projet de loi dépasse les...
And its current form, it goes beyond the mandate of the federal government and its jurisdiction, overriding provincial projects of the Athabasca oil sands and other petrochemical industries, which find themselves within the limits of the province, its jurisdiction, and are already subject to provincial regulation.
And to the federal government, that the threat posed by C-69 cannot be dismissed as a uniquely Alberta issue. Yes, I'm here to represent my province, but I'm also standing up, I believe, for the interests of Canada's national economy. When Alberta's energy sector suffers, it cascades through the whole economy, as recent statistics yet again demonstrated sluggish growth in the Canadian economy precisely because of what's happening in our energy industry. A study from the University of Calgary School of Public Policy estimates recently that pipeline capacity constraints are costing Canadians some $14 billion a year in lost revenue, with about $7.2 billion forfeited from provincial royalties and other taxes, $5 billion lost by industry, and the rest being lost at the federal level. But don't just take my word for how devastating C-69 would be for Canada. Listen to the people who decide every day whether or not to invest in our country and create jobs here. La Société Totale, une pétrolière française.
Total, a French petro company, have estimated that Bill C-69 will make it much less likely that we will invest in energy projects or to make commitments linked to pipeline capacity in Canada.
And are threatening to vote with their feet. Every energy industry association has been lining up at this committee to show how the expanded scope of assessment, unlimited interventions, and endless opportunities to extend timelines will make investor uncertainty even greater where it already is in a crisis situation. Equally worrisome is who you're not hearing from. It's impossible to calculate the value of projects that investors aren't bothering to propose. Foreign investors are saying they cannot be bothered to spend the time figuring out a country that cannot resolve its internal differences. They're not going to waste good money on pointless, protracted regulatory exercises that would now be further lengthened by this bill. Madam President, it's simply baffling to Albertans and to most Canadians who understand the facts that we as a country would inflict this punishment on ourselves. The Canadian oil and gas industry has the most highly regulated, cleanest, fairest, and most inclusive resource management regime on the face of the planet. And I note that the bill includes a mandate for a gender assessment of these projects. There is no energy industry in the world that employs more women than the Canadian energy industry. There is no province that has a higher level of employment and incomes for Aboriginal people than the province of Alberta. Why? Primarily because of this industry. This industry has been a tool of social progress, Madam President. Tens of thousands of Canadians who were living in despondent independency and unemployment moved to Alberta because of the industry attacked by this bill. So if your interest is in social progress, then why would we create yet further uncertainty and damage for an industry that has been one of the greatest engines of social progress? If your industry is growing the middle class and making it easier for people to join it, then why would you do further damage through this bill to the industry that has been the greatest engine of middle class growth in the modern Canadian economy? This is inexplicable to us. This bill delivers the exact opposite of what the Liberal Party promised in its 2015 platform, which stated that we will end, quotes, the practice of having federal ministers interfere in the environmental assessment process. But the bill, as now drafted, does the exact opposite. There will be more political interference than ever before under SIA. Despite the promise of improved approval timelines, C-69 has more than earned the name the No More Pipelines Act. It provides repeated opportunities for the minister to intervene and pause the process. It creates a regime that limits the information taken into account in decision-making and raises serious questions about natural justice and procedural fairness. As I've said, Alberta alone is not alone in raising these concerns. I know my time is limited, so let me focus on what to me is really the essential issue for us. As I outlined in my letter to this committee on April 9th, such a broad review and decision-making process that is included in this bill flies clearly in the face of Section 9210 of the Constitution Act, which speaks to projects or activities that constitute local works or undertakings. These are projects involved in the exploration of natural resources and sites and facilities in the province for electrical production, all of which fall within exclusive provincial jurisdiction under the Constitution. This bill, as written, would give the federal government final say on the construction and operation of these kinds of provincial projects based on factors unrelated to any legitimate federal jurisdiction. This is directly contrary to the Supreme Court of Canada's 1992 Old Man Dam River decision. The Old Man Dam River Society decision. The Supreme Court ruled that the federal environmental assessments, quotes, can only affect matters that are truly in relation to an institution or activity that is within federal legislative jurisdiction. With no limitations spelled out in C-69 on the scope of federal assessments and approvals, this bill disregards the balance, the delicate and important constitutional balance between federal and provincial powers. This is particularly galling as it violates Section 92A of the Constitution, which I've mentioned before, which was a condition precedent of Alberta's signature on the Constitution Act. The Section 92A clearly spells out that as I understand, the federal government released yesterday its proposed criteria for projects under this bill, and purports, amongst other things, to regulate the development of in situ oil sites in Alberta. These are Alberta, exclusively within Alberta territory. They relate to the production of natural resources. There is no rational person who could see under Section 92A a federal interest to regulate that. It would be a blatant violation of the Constitution. The federal government is asking you to violate the Constitution of Canada in adopting this bill. And that's why, should this proceed in its current form, we will see the federal government in court and have a very high level of confidence about prevailing there. If this committee decides to proceed with the bill, I ask that it, however, be substantially rewritten to respect our exclusive provincial jurisdiction. That means that the amendment packages, as I've mentioned, proposed by CAP and CEPA and the previous Alberta government, in our judgment, must be adopted in their entirety with no exceptions. This bill does not need a nip and tuck. It needs complete reconstructive surgery, or it needs to be put out of its misery. Madam Chairman, thank you for your time. I and Minister Savage are happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much. So we're going to start with the Senator Cordy, member of the steering committee.
Thank you very much. In light of the limited time, we've only got about half an hour left, and the number of Albertans around the table, I'll give up my time so that those from Alberta can have more time for questions.
Thank you for that. So let's start with the senators from Alberta, if you agree. No, see, no opposition. No, okay. Senator Simons.
Mr. Premier, this microphone is very unhappy with me. I'm sorry. I, like you, received a copy of the project list yesterday. I was intrigued to see that it covers in situ production, which, as you mentioned, Premier Notley, who came before you, also had very strong feelings about. It does, however, have a proviso that says that the in situ would be exempted if there were a legislated hard cap on greenhouse gas emissions. And I wondered how you felt about that as a proviso.
I think that proviso does nothing to mitigate the clear violation of Section 92A of the Constitution. So I think it's beyond presumptuous of the federal government to lay down conditions for whether or not it violates the Constitution. I would further emphasize that there is a statutory limit on CO2 emissions in the Alberta oil sands adopted by the last Alberta legislature at 100 megatons. And my government has no intention of changing that. We are opposed, just to be clear, we do believe that this makes no sense, that only Canada, amongst major energy producers, would cap its production and potential prosperity. We don't see the United States, Russia, Venezuela, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or any other country doing the same thing. So we think it's frankly pointless in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions, and it prejudicially hurts Canada's long-term interests. But we're not close to hitting that cap right now. And quite frankly, our government has a lot of other irons in the fire, including this bill, Bill C-48, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and many other issues. And so for us at this time, that is not an active issue.
Now, I mean, the federal government has long-standing jurisdiction over things like interprovincial pipelines, interprovincial power lines, things that affect migratory birds or navigable waterways. So are there things other than the in situ that you feel are specifically an abridgment of 92A?
Sure. Well, I guess what's important here is to distinguish really clearly between what's federal jurisdiction and what's provincial jurisdiction. And the project list, as published yesterday, the discussion paper, really muddies the water. It expands the project list that was in CIA 2012. And our position is that if it is in provincial jurisdiction, we don't need to be talking about thresholds and factors that would make it subject to federal assessment. If it's provincial jurisdiction, the federal government should just get out of it and let Alberta regulate. Alberta's in the best position to assess and regulate those projects.
Senator LeBoucan-Benson.
Thank you, Chair. Premier Kenney, you've answered my questions on jurisdiction very well, but I do have a question for Minister Savage. I know that you have studied this bill probably forensically. You have a lot of experience in this, in pipelines. I know you've worked for Enbridge. What is your top two amendments if you were going to instruct this committee? What would you like to see changed?
Well, I guess to start with, we need to distinguish between the amendments that project proponents and industry associations have put forward and the amendments the province has put forward. Our amendments are focused fairly significantly on jurisdictional issues, on making sure that the federal government does not intrude into provincial jurisdiction. The industry associations and industry have put forward regulations that make a project review workable. So I guess for us, obviously as a province, our number one amendments are to clearly distinguish between federal and provincial jurisdiction, to keep the federal assessment out of our projects. But from From another perspective, I guess when you look at the legislation overall, from a technical level on why it doesn't work, I think everybody started out looking for a process and a review process that was going to be independent of the government, that was going to be conducted by a tribunal, an agency, a regulator based on science, fact, and evidence, that was arm's length from the government. What Bill C-69 gives, is really just a political review of a project from start to end, with opportunities and points for political interference by the minister, right from the get-go of what projects would be reviewed, to timelines, to scope of factors, to the political decision at the end. And you just cannot reconcile that vision and that process with an independent arm's length process.
We're definitely working on ministerial discretion on this bill. I'm wondering just very quickly, what are your opinions on the regional assessments in this bill, the capacity to do the cumulative effects regional assessment pieces?
Well, I guess the regional assessments are important, but one of the concerns, first and foremost, is that projects will be held up while those regional assessments are being undertaken. Those assessments take a very long time, and we cannot hold up projects while those assessments are underway.
Thank you.
Senator Carignan.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Monsieur le Premier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Premier, I was pleased to hear your introductory remarks. That was indeed the first topic I wanted to inquire about, and that is constitutional areas of jurisdiction. And what you have stated is exactly in line with the Government of Quebec, and in fact to the decision of the Supreme Court of Canada regarding protecting provincial areas of jurisdiction. And when I saw the list of designated projects that we received last night, I worked overnight and late into the night reading it. And you hit the nail on the head. It is encroaching on provincial areas of jurisdiction, and even the oil sands have been included on that list, and that's clearly a blatant violation. Now, I'd like to turn to another topic now, and that is that of an energy corridor. I raised the question in a number of contexts. As you know, we toured Canada on this issue, and it strikes me that the bill should include a mechanism regarding energy corridors so that one place in Canada, be it from the east of Canada through to the west of Canada, that a stretch of 500 metres would be designated where transportation lines, whether it be gas, hydroelectric, oil, where that kind of link could be established. This is the case for the Trans-Canadian. We have one for bikes, but not for energy, and it strikes me as being a completely logical response. Indeed, Senator, it strikes me as common sense to develop that kind of corridor for resources, and that is why my party included the notion in our election platform as one of its planks. And 55% of Albertan voters gave it their approval. And that was just over a week ago. I've already raised this question with some of my provincial counterparts, and I'm very much looking forward to having the opportunity to putting it on the agenda of the Council of the Federation on the 6th of July. What I can tell you at this stage is there's a lot of interest with the provinces of Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and I dare say Quebec, I hope at least.
Under Bill C-69, Mr. Premier, the standing test has been removed, so people can be granted standing at a regulatory hearing even if they're not directly impacted by a project. Years ago, I did an inquiry in the Senate, and I remember Senator Mitchell spoke at that inquiry about groups, environmental groups, being funded by foreign foundations and foreign entities. Do you have a strategy for that? Because money is still pouring into this country. We had a witness here the last time I sat at this committee from Mining Watch, which was funded by the Ford Foundation, interestingly enough. Anyway, yes.
Yes, thank you, Senator. I alluded to this in my opening remarks. The platform on which we were recently elected with 55% of the popular vote had as a key element a strategy to fight back against the malignant influence of foreign-funded special interests in the highly successful campaign to landlock Canadian energy. As you likely know, in 2008, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund hosted a conference with a consortium of interest groups, which developed a long-term strategy to prevent the construction of pipelines, to essentially bottleneck and strangle the Canadian energy industry, more particularly the oil sands. And I find it interesting that a number of prominent members of the current government, including the Chief of Staff to the Minister of the Environment, who worked for several years at the Pembina Institute, received that organization under his watch, received substantial funding from donors who are members of, who are partners in the so-called tar sands campaign, as was the former principal secretary to the Prime Minister, a strong advocate of this bill, who worked at the World Wildlife Fund, which received funds from the same U.S. foundations which are members of the so-called tar sands campaign, as are other prominent members of the government. These are the same individuals who campaigned against the Northern Gateway and secured its immediate veto, contrary to the approval of the National Energy Board and the previous cabinet immediately following the last election. This is the same government, informed by the same people and the same interest groups, which surrendered without a word of protest to President Obama's veto of the Keystone XL pipeline 3 days after the current Canadian government took office. This is the same government that strangled Energy East after TransCanada had spent over $1 billion in 6 years investing in it through the imposition of regulatory mandates, which the federal government now seeks to enshrine in this legislation. This is the same campaign of obstruction that succeeded in driving Kinder Morgan out of this country, leaving us as taxpayers holding the bag. I reiterate. So yes, we do have a strategy, and in fact, we'll be launching a public inquiry into the foreign sources of funds behind the anti-Canadian energy campaign. We will be challenging, where we believe there are grounds to do so, the charitable status of some of these organizations that have been funneling foreign money into our politics. We will adopt a bill banning foreign money from Alberta politics, and we endorse Senator Frum's bill in the Senate in this respect. We will be removing any Alberta government funding from organizations that have participated in this campaign, and we will be pursuing a number of other steps. These organizations have the right to speak their minds, but we will hold them to account when they lie and defame our energy industry. We will tell the truth about it aggressively.
Thank you very much. Senator Frum.
My private member's bill, which unfortunately is one of the bills that has been stalled in the Senate, I'm sorry to say. We have heard at this committee from a great number of witnesses who have warned about the serious implications of Bill C-69, you being the most eloquent among them. But to date, the government, these arguments do not seem to have penetrated the thinking of the federal government. Why do you think that is? And can you elaborate on what you think the threat to national unity would be if this bill is passed?
Well, thank you. On the first question, Senator, I really have a hard time grasping the rationale of this bill, given the gravity of concerns that have been expressed. You all know, as senators, that there is growing anxiety about the crisis of confidence of the international investment community in Canada. That is one of the reasons for relatively anemic economic growth. This bill would make it worse, not just with respect to oil and gas, but with other industries, precisely because of the uncertainty that it implies. On the second question, let me let's play a bit of a mental exercise here. Imagine we were in a moment in our history where there was something like 50% support in public opinion polls for Quebec's secession from the Federation. Can you imagine, under such circumstances, a federal government bringing forward a bill which constituted a direct and obvious violation, intrusion into exclusive provincial jurisdiction, which would have the clear effect of undermining Quebec's largest industry and largest employer, I submit that that would be unthinkable, that no responsible federal government would proceed with such a measure. This was a message I conveyed to Prime Minister Trudeau in a phone conversation 2 weeks ago, that I've been around the federal cabinet table, and I can tell you, prime ministers, federal cabinets are quite rightly constantly anxious about the preservation of national unity, and every perceived slight by the government of Quebec is weighted, measured, and carefully considered. This is not just a slight to the people of Alberta. This is the culmination of a full frontal attack on our economic prosperity. And this is why, shockingly, up to half of the people of Alberta in an Angus Reid poll recently, this is not some fly-by-night operation, said that they support secession. I suspect a lot of them, Senator, are blowing off steam and finding that as a way to express their frustration. But your role as senators, I mean, your role is to represent the regions in the Parliament of Canada. And thank goodness, I know all of you are passionate federalists. Please understand the people of Alberta are proud Canadians. So proud that they are proud to have contributed over $600 billion to the rest of the Federation since 1957, according to Professor Robert Mansell, through the system of fiscal federalism. They don't begrudge their neighbors in the Federation the support that they are able to provide through the development of our resources. But all they ask is the right and the ability to develop those resources. So if this bill proceeds together with C-48, it will be a message to the people of Alberta that their federal government doesn't care about a devastating period of economic adversity in our province and is so careless about it that it's prepared to violate exclusive provincial jurisdiction. I plead with you as federalists to understand the national unity implications of this. And that is why I have said, to be clear, if this bill proceeds in its current form, and if we can't get at least one coastal pipeline, we will take the extraordinary measure of triggering the Quebec secession reference of the Supreme Court from 1998 to hold a constitutional referendum on Section 36 of the Constitution, which is equalization. We don't oppose equalization, but we oppose equalization if we cannot develop the resources that pay for it.
Thank you. Senator Massicotte.
Thank you, Premier, for being with us this morning. Let me first assure you, I think I can speak on behalf of nearly all of us here. We hear you loud and clear. We've heard many, many witnesses loud and clear. And I'm convinced our efforts will be sincere to try to find a balance which is so necessary. It may not totally satisfy you, but I think our objective is to do what is right for Canada, including the province of Alberta. Let me talk to you. You talked about investors fleeing our country, fleeing Alberta. But investors nowadays, to a very large majority, are very sensitive to where they invest and to invest in situations that are deemed to be acceptable to society and behave in a manner that was coherent with our long-term interests, economically, and environment, and socially. And when you made reference earlier to the cap for in situ, and you made reference, I read in the paper, that the cap is so significantly high it won't affect you, so you have no problem maintaining it. But that may give the impression to somebody, and I'll give you a chance to comment, gives the impression to maybe some investors, including foreign investors, saying the oil sands will be developed in a way that's irresponsible, given the cap is so high, it's meaningless, and therefore province of Alberta and producers will be exploring all this without caring about the amount of CO2 or greenhouse gas that it affects. Could you comment on that? Because I think several years ago, the province became very sensitive to that image in the world, because I think it's very destructive if people think otherwise. So could you reassure all of us that irrespective of the cap being insignificant or irrelevant, that all this will be done irrespectively in a very responsible way?
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate your comments. First, I wouldn't characterize it as insignificant or irrelevant. I think in the midterm it may become relevant. It's not right now, and so our focus is on more timely issues. And with respect to the relationship to investment, let me say that there is no other major oil and gas producer in the world which has proposed a cap on its production. And that has not forestalled investment in those other jurisdictions. I'll give you, for me, a very topical example. HSBC, which I think may be the world's largest bank in terms of market cap, has announced that it will no longer provide financing to the Alberta oil sands projects. Meanwhile, they just hosted a major investment conference in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, a country in which they are a major financial investor in Saudi energy products. There is no emissions cap in Saudi Arabia. HSBC, I understand, is one of the largest financiers of the heavy oil industry in Vladimir Putin's corrupt, autocratically owned Russian energy industry. There's no cap on Russia. So what you have here, I believe, is nothing but empty virtue signaling. Now, I'll just close by saying that we do respond to this concern. Our government does want to demonstrate that Albertans are environmentally sensitive, and we do care about the challenge of climate change and emissions. And that is why we'll be instituting a levy on major industrial emissions, including from the oil and gas sector, which incentivizes a constant reduction in carbon intensity. And we will be introducing that initially at a $20 a ton price for major industrial emissions. We project that will reduce by 47 megatons output in Alberta from the original baseline year. And we'll be open, as I indicated to the Prime Minister, additional stringency in this respect.
Could I just
Dr. Wu.
Sorry, Senator.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Premier. On the cap, if you are keeping the cap, and there is lots of room given the current level of emissions, as a practical matter, in situ projects should not fall under the project list designation. Is that fair to say? As a practical matter, setting aside your concerns, legitimate concerns around provincial jurisdiction.
As a practical matter, I don't think there will ever be a federal environmental regulation of in situ projects because the courts won't tolerate a prima facie violation of the Constitution.
But based on the level of emissions today and the cap which you are willing to maintain, is it correct to say that for the foreseeable future in situ projects will not be designated because they will fall under the cap that you are willing to maintain?
Well, you'd have to ask the federal government. They've come up with these parameters. All I can say is we believe that the emissions cap doesn't make sense because no other country is doing it. We don't intend. We don't have plans for any immediate changes. This matter will ultimately, if the bill passes, be litigated, and it will also be subject to political judgment in the upcoming federal election.
Okay. You've confirmed, though, that the current level of emissions is significantly lower than the cap that is currently in place.
It is currently.
Thank you. Do you recognize federal jurisdiction over GHG emissions and other pollutants that come from oil and gas and other industries?
Look, I think in answer to some of the project list criteria that in situ would be exempt if there was a emissions cap. To start with, you can't exempt something that you don't have the right to regulate in the first place. That's preposterous and shouldn't be in there. That's a flagrant violation of the Constitution. And that's why we find it so objectionable for the federal government to say they will exempt something that they don't have the right to regulate.
So that's my second question. Do you recognize federal jurisdiction over GHG emissions? And
The Old Man Dam decision set out some parameters on environment not being a delineated head of power in the Constitution. So there's some intricate constitutional law on who has the right to regulate environment.
And I would just add that that in part is before the courts of the appeal courts of Saskatchewan and Ontario with respect to their carbon tax references.
Okay.
Senator Simon.
Alberta's position on this. And Premier, you've made. Sorry. Okay. Premier, you've made mention of it, as has Minister Savage, and we've heard from witnesses coming from many sectors
that this bill creates uncertainty and a lack of transparency, and it certainly is not based on science. The bill introduces policy issues into the project assessment process, and it politicizes the review process by allowing for ministerial decision-making, even at the end of a long and expensive review process. How would you deal with this aspect of the bill, especially given your own personal experience as a federal minister sitting at the cabinet table making decisions, and now with your provincial perspective?
Which aspect of the bill, sorry, Senator?
It's the aspect that introduces policy into the impact review process, and then allows for ministerial decision making right up until the very end.
That's one of our primary objections to the bill. As I cited, the platform of the current federal government in the last election was to remove ministers from interfering in environmental reviews. And yet this bill inserts them more deeply into environmental reviews. In an effort ostensibly to depoliticize environmental review, it massively politicizes environmental review. I can tell you, Senator, I remember very clearly when Northern Gateway, because you asked about my experience in cabinet, when Northern Gateway was coming up from the National Energy Board, was in the stages of a final review at the National Energy Board prior to its submission to the federal cabinet for ratification. I hope I'm not violating the cabinet confidence here, but this is, I think, fairly obvious. We received very clear advice from the Department of Justice, which was emphasized by the then Prime Minister, that as federal ministers, we should not do or say anything which would be seen as prejudicing us, expressing a prejudicial approach to. We had to maintain an objective view to the evidence as a federal cabinet, and not politicize that project. In fact, I've been criticized for not having done more tub thumping about Northern Gateway at the time. The reason was we didn't want to demonstrate any kind of a prejudicial attitude for or against it. So I would submit the previous government tried to, obviously we were advocates of pipelines in general and in principle, but we understood the regulator had to be independent. And this, I think, undermines that independence.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, Ms. Rani, we have 3 last questions. Dalphon, Patterson, and Muckler.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci, Monsieur le Premier.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson, and thank you, Minister, or Premier, rather.
Development and protection of the environment, the need to have a competitive regulatory framework, and the need to preserve provincial jurisdictions. And I think I follow you all the way there. And that's, I think, my colleagues are looking for, and in the ways to improve that bill and to take into consideration these concerns. But I haven't heard anything about other constitutional rights, such as the rights of the First Nations, that are also protected against under the Constitution. So what are you proposing? Because many First Nations have appeared before this committee and before their committees, referring to the need that they appreciate the fact that C-69 take into consideration the fact that they'll be heard and that their interests will be taken into consideration. And you know that you've referred to delays in these projects. Well, many of these delays are resulting from court decisions that are preventing these projects to go forward because First Nations interests were not properly considered.
Thank you, Senator, for raising the important question. First, I would say that any statutory requirement to consult First Nations on environmental projects is, in a sense, redundant because this is now a delineated constitutional obligation under current jurisprudence. The duty and honor of the Crown to engage in meaningful consultation with First Nations is not negotiable. So I think it's implicit. It doesn't. This bill doesn't add to that. It just reflects what is an existing constitutional obligation of the federal Crown. And I would just further point out that. Yes, indeed. I would point out that while you have heard from some First Nations groups that are in favor of the bill, you've also heard from a number who are opposed to the bill. And I do know that when you did hearings in Calgary 3 weeks ago, You heard from a number of those interveners. My sense is that a pretty clear majority of First Nations communities in Alberta are at least concerned or at most strongly opposed to this bill. As I've said before, for senators who are not familiar with Alberta, there are many First Nations that have become quite frankly wealthy, Maskatchewites, Fort McKay, and many others, by being business partners in the oil and gas industry. And in fact, our government intends to create a new Crown corporation to be styled the Alberta Opportunities Corporation to provide financial backstopping to facilitate First Nations financial participation and ownership in major energy projects. Because we see this as a moral cause, the opportunity to raise Indigenous Canadians from poverty to prosperity by participating in projects for resources that are developed under the territories that these people historically have inhabited. And so I can tell you, yes, absolutely, we respect the Crown's duty to consult, but we also respect the economic rights of First Nations to participate in our economy. That's why we'll also be setting up a litigation fund to support pro-development First Nations who believe that their economic rights have been violated by this federal government in its vetoing of Northern Gateway and its tanker ban Bill C-48.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank the Premier for commenting on the pernicious influence of foreign-funded opponents of oil and gas development in Canada, which was a question I was going to ask. But I'd like to turn to the National Energy Board. You've talked about the politicization of the regulatory process reflected in Bill 69. You called it a political bill. One of the justifications for C-69 was to restore public confidence in the regulatory process. The rationale was the NEB had been discredited. C-69 diminishes the role of the NEB. Was the NEB an ineffective, discredited regulatory process?
I don't think it was perfect, but I don't think it was discredited. I've seen a commentary that suggests the NEB process. The NEB, headquartered in Calgary, has historically been considered a model regulator by other jurisdictions. I can tell you, when I was a federal minister traveling in parts of the world that were developing like shale gas industries, they asked if they could get some training and mentorship from the NEB on how to develop a regulatory framework. So it was, from my experience, considered a bit of a model around the world. Admittedly imperfect, but do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure I do. During the course of this review that led up to C-69, there was an NEB modernization panel that went around the country and took submissions. And there was a lot of really good material that went into that. And basically, I think you can look at what happened over the last decade with the National Energy Board as these larger linear pipeline projects went through the process, that there was a lot of public policy decisions and broader public policy that the National Energy Board was forced to have to deal with. It policy around climate change, energy policy, the mix of energy, Indigenous rights and reconciliation, that the board was never prepared and equipped to deal with. But there was no other place to deal with those policy issues, so the board had to deal with them. And as a result of that, at the end of those processes, people were not satisfied. People who were opposed to pipelines were not satisfied, and they blamed it on the regulatory process. So I think it's a bit unfair to say that the National Energy Board had a discredited process. I think they were just not equipped to deal with the policy issues, which, by the way, Bill C-69 doubles down and makes it worse by forcing those policy issues to be dealt with in the process. We're making a bad situation doubly worse.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have to, it's end.
Some
Senator
senators
Muckler,
have got 3 questions.
sorry.
I just want 2.
It's 9 o'clock. And we have the minister. Senator Muckler.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Puis,
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. And I'd like to thank and congratulate the new Premier Kennedy for his leadership. He's had experience, a wealth of experience across Canada, both, in fact, domestically and abroad.
We have an opportunity to ensure that Atlantic Canadians have a framework that can provide environmental sustainability along with economic progress. And Premier Higgs shared that with us this week here in Ottawa. Atlantic Canada wants its equal opportunity. And I feel that across Canada there's a lot of anger and division. We all have a role to play, and I like your approach when you say it's about national unity. But I think we've lost a can-do approach in every areas of Canada. In Atlantic Canada, we have the biggest refinery in the country. There's something terribly wrong. We cannot access our natural resources coming from Western Canada. When I look at the Irving refinery, the Irving refinery is getting oil from foreign countries, not to say dictatorships. And I think there's a time where we are now that we can, and I hope we will succeed, to bring back the can-do approach. My question to you is, with your monumental experience, previously and now and going forward with what I've heard this morning, can you tell me, and for Atlantic Canadians, how we can build a pipeline?
Thank you, Senator. I've spoken with your Premier Higgs about this on several occasions and share with him entirely the hope and dream of renewing a project such as Energy East so that Central Canadians can displace foreign, increasingly U.S. oil imports, and Atlantic Canadians can help to add value and export those products to the rest of the world, getting a fair price. It was regrettable, I believe, that the Prime Minister, in response to Premier Higgs, gave the province of Quebec an effective veto over a prospective interprovincial pipeline, which would be a matter of federal regulatory jurisdiction. But Senator, if this bill passes, the faint hope of some future East Coast pipeline is completely dead. I mean, I guess this is the last question. I mean, let's be clear. The industry, nobody, no board is going to come forward with a final investment decision to risk billions of shareholder dollars to go into a sinkhole of a process that represents nothing but uncertainty, endless interventions, and the constant possibility of political interference. So the dream of which you speak, which is the opportunity to create more wealth in a province that is struggling and in a region that has struggled economically, dies with the adoption of C-69 in anything like its current form.
Thank you very much, Premier, for this interesting conversation.